Welcome, everyone, to the Corner Table Podcast, a podcast by world builders for world builders. Today, I'm one of your hosts, Xavier. I'm also joined by our other two hosts.
Hi, I'm Kevin.
And Braylon.
And today we are going to be rebuilding Star Wars. I'm excited for this one. We're going to see how we could make it better since we're such skilled,
we
writers,
clearly know more.
Yeah, exactly.
Than one of the most successful film franchises of all time.
Exactly. But I think it would be hard to find a person who doesn't think that Star Wars has kind of degraded over time. They've had some trouble. We think that a lot of that trouble has to do with world building and that we could have some potential fixes to it.
It certainly didn't help.
It certainly didn't help. There's been three trilogies of movies and many other things, books, games and stuff, but not a lot of cohesion in terms of the world. It's hard to do in these larger scale worlds.
Yeah, and over such a long period of time.
Exactly. No, I mean, no one can do it perfectly. Shout out to other universes that have tried, like Marvel. Honestly,
it gets hard to maintain.
At least in Star Wars, you know who is dead or alive.
Right.
So that helps. It doesn't change week to week.
Yeah.
But we are going to each bring a pitch of something that we could change in Star Wars to rebuild it for the better. They're all separate.
Yep.
We're going to start with Braylon.
Yeah. So mine is probably the broadest topic of the three. And I was specifically looking at, what is the big problem that I see with Star Wars is struggling with right now? Right. And I think it has to do with their inability to move beyond the Skywalker versus Palpatine dynamic. You've kind of got, you've got these two families, but really, like, you've got this one family and this dude that are just like going back and forth in the ring for approximately a century, and the problem that I see, even of like leaving the original trilogy, just saying like that stands by itself, cool. Sure. With like the Luke Skywalker versus the Emperor Palpatine storyline,
like,
that's totally cool.
A good storyline.
Yeah, that leaving that essentially as it is, and then the issue that I see in the prequels is that like everything has to now fit into that. Mm-hmm. And some of it makes sense of like, okay, we set out to tell the story of Darth Vader, who, fair enough, one of the most iconic villains of all time. Yeah. Great. That's a great story. Give him somebody else to kind of butt heads with. We don't need to have the same through line of Palpatine just is evil.
He's
all the way
evil
through.
Force. Yeah.
And Skywalker is essentially good all the way through. Obviously, it's a good that struggles with darkness, and that's that's interesting enough.
It's a little more egregious in the sequels.
It is significantly more egregious in the sequels. But one thing I did want to bring up, even in the prequels, is we have this idea of like everything has to feed into the original trilogy.
Yes.
Right.
Even like, there's no reason for C-3PO to be Anakin's droid, and it also makes him like he's there and has no idea what's going on throughout the original trilogy. It's like,
you think he might have been like, by the way, Luke, I remember when you were a baby.
Yeah, I know your dad.
Yeah.
Like, it's just very odd. And then also looking at the sequel trilogy, and like everything just has to be a reference. And we almost got away from the Palpatine thing, but then somehow Palpatine returned. And you get that wonderful line to explain away, and you go, oh, okay, so we are right back to, and you even think that you get away from the Skywalker thing until the very end of that movie when Rey's like, I'm also a Skywalker. You're like, well, frick this.
So the Palpatine who became a Skywalker, it's full circle. It's like poetry, it rhymes.
Well,
come on.
And that's the problem.
we got 9 movies.
Yeah.
And they're all one note through line.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It all ends up feeling very samey.
Yeah.
it all ends up being very samey, which means the stuff that feels the same, like episode 7 gets criticized for feeling samey because you're like, you just redid episode 4. And then you go into something like The Acolyte, which I didn't watch, but I saw the reviews, that tries to do something very, very different. And everyone's like, well, this isn't Star Wars. And it's like, well, that's because Star Wars has become one note. Yes. And this is not that one note, regardless of whether the writing and the storyline of that is good or whatever.
What did The Acolyte try to do different?
It doesn't have any. It's set like they don't give a specific timeline, but it's hundreds, if not thousands, of years before. The episode 1.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean that has been, and it's been done successfully outside of movies, because outside of movies and TV, because for movies and TV it's all Skywalker Saga and The Acolyte, because I mean even the Boba Fett show and
it all takes place within that same like time
era.
frame. You don't have, and then because of that you have to play by that time frame's rules.
And it kind of goes against, honestly, some of the feeling set up from the original movies. Long ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's called Star Wars. It's setting up this picture of this large universe where there's lots of conflict. You get all these planets and all these exciting things. But now we're in 2023, but we're still doing
this, essentially the same Star Wars.
Same Star Wars, which is a feud between one guy and the rest of the universe, aka the Skywalkers.
Yeah. It feels like you have this very, very broad galaxy, but your focus is so narrow.
And you also have this whole light side versus dark side of the Force theme going through, but the dark side of the Force is really only exemplified in one or two
man.
Individuals.
And the light side of the Force is primarily only exemplified in one bloodline.
True.
Like you have other people.
We get in the prequels we get at least some other Jedi doing things,
but they're very minor characters.
With
the exception of Obi-Wan, who also is primarily there because he has to show up later.
Exactly. Versus and there's other problems that come up with that, with this whole the universe having to force this specic plot line. Even the idea of, you guys know the rule of 2.
Which
they
very much get away from when it's like, oh, he's a dark side user, but he's a count.
But even that just feels like it's a way to force it to be about, well, no, there weren't actually any other Sith or bad guys with lightsabers. It was just the Emperor and Darth Vader. That conflict was always happening. It was only the Emperor and Count Dooku that
Is canonically the rule of 2, is that supposed to be that like it's a fundamental constant of the universe that there can only be 2 Sith, or is it more of an observed?
It was
anytime you have more than 2 Sith in a room, one of them will die.
The rule of 2, not to go too far straight, the rule of 2, they made it's a rule of the Sith essentially that was made not that long ahead of the movies. It's like maybe 3 or 4 generations. One Sith was like, okay, to be really bad, we can only have 2 of us. So he went and killed everybody else, and so it was just him and his apprentice. And then the apprentice
has to kill the master, and then the master gets an apprentice who inevitably kills him, despite presumably the master doesn't want to be killed, but at the same time does want an apprentice with the knowledge that eventually this is the deal.
It's like weirdly selfless that we have to serve the dark side.
It's very odd.
But again, that feels like it's just kind of crowbarred so that we can have Palpatine versus Skywalkers.
Yes. And I think what moving away from that offers us is a couple of things. One, it allows us we have this massive galaxy, and we're telling very small stories, which is fine. But
it's the same small story.
It's the same small story, and it doesn't allow us to just kind of have a standalone story that's set just over there.
No.
This portion of the galaxy is all in their Skywalker versus Palpatine thing. We can't go and talk about this dude who's he's got his own stuff going on. And is a very separate story. We've gotten a couple of those kind of branching out with some of the new TV shows and stuff. Some of it
even Han Solo,
well,
unfortunately,
some of it did not.
Unfortunately, Solo starred Han Solo, who's a known Star Wars character.
Right.
Otherwise, it would be that. It's just
Here's
some smugglers doing smuggler things.
Yeah. Yeah, and there have been some things that have kind of tried to branch that out, and it just hasn't felt
natural.
Sure. And then, like, I mean, shout out to Andor, which is, I would say, phenomenal. And they did kind of just somehow manage to break free of that and be like, it is technically a known character, but he's a secondary character in Rogue One.
Yes.
So he's technically a known character. But
which I was going to ask about, how do you feel about then Rogue One fitting into the Skywalker Palpatine problem, because neither of those two dynasties really come into play in Rogue One directly.
True, and that is,
go
ahead. We do see Darth Vader in it.
We do see Darth Vader
very, very briefly for a great scene. Probably the best scene in the show.
I was literally going to say the opposite, but go ahead. You can,
oh, really? Okay, whatever. But I think. I think that a whole movie just kind of exists to plug a plot hole of why did the Empire build a very easily destroyable death machine. But I think it's still it's still serving that story very, very much so, which Andor is as well. But Andor almost takes even a step back even further, because Rogue One is very much feeds directly into New Hope.
Yes.
And is essentially it's a prequel to
it's Star Wars 3.5.
Yes. Where Andor is kind of its own thing. It's still taking place at the beginning of the rebellion.
Yeah.
And so it's got to follow those rules, but it is very much its own thing and its own tone. For example, there are no Force users.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Certainly no Jedi, no Sith or anything like that.
There are other ways to stay in there. Like, there's a Star Wars book I read that it was set during the war. I think it technically starts right around Episode 5. But it's set in a company of rebel soldiers. With no Jedi around. And so it's more about, like the war part and how they can struggle through. And we're not focusing on the great question of the Force. It's just on what's going on the ground with the people, and it can really work quite well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what were you looking to go? Was there a place you were looking to go by getting away from Palpatine and the Skywalkers?
What I don't have a specific of this is the kind of story that I want to see. I just want to see other stories told in the Star Wars universe.
Yes.
And I think obviously at this point, with everything that we're going to mention, it's this is an unsolvable problem because the movies and TV shows already exist. And we didn't write them, so we can't retroactively do anything about that. But I think getting rid of that would help. I don't know that it would for sure solve the problem that Star Wars is dealing with right now, because I would argue it's largely a writing problem. But I think it at least opens it up beyond this very one-dimensional story that we all kind of go well, that's Star Wars, and anything else just kind of doesn't feel quite Star Wars-y.
I think it good.
In your opinion, then, what would be the essence of Star Wars that you're trying to get at that's not a part of the Skywalker Palpatine storyline?
Sure. I would say the essence of Star Wars that I would have remain would be the Force. That's kind of what I would say sets Star Wars apart from just generic sci-fi. Just this is a story that is told with spaceships and planets.
Yes.
The Force is kind of the through line that exists throughout the universe. And so I think that would be the through line that needs to stay, at least to an extent. And then when it's not there, say in something like Andor, it is noticed that you're like, oh, this is set in the Star Wars universe, and we're not dealing with the Force, and that becomes its own interesting thing. Not that the Force isn't mentioned. Like the Force is like mentioned as kind of like a spiritual thing,
Right.
But it is not. There are not Force users.
Sort of in the style of how it's talked about in Episode 4.
Yeah,
where that's not really well defined as like a source of power. It's more of just a thing that is.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's known by most people. I think that's very cool. I think that's very true. There's also other just motifs that you can bring along to make it feel more Star Wars-y that don't have to be with the Skywalkers and Palpatine in particular.
Yeah.
A lot of people like Star Wars because of lightsabers.
Yep.
That's fair.
Great.
I think lightsabers are
keep
cool.
the lightsabers. That's totally fine. And in fact, you can keep most of the same storylines. Just change a couple names, and the problem is solved.
But like you can tell all kinds of stories, and if you want to make it feel like Star Wars, it's like, okay, let's bring along some Star Wars things.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be about Palpatine again.
Right.
We could have another bad guy. There could be other reasons for people to be evil. Or for people to be good.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah. Also, just Palpatine was never that compelling of a villain.
No.
He was,
so to make him be like your guy, it's like, but Darth Vader was always so much cooler.
Darth Vader's very cool.
And like the whole conflict in 5 and 6 is more about Luke and his own dark side.
Right.
Luke, and does he have mercy on his father?
Exactly.
And then Palpatine is an external force rather than a direct villain. He's closer to like Sauron. I would not want Sauron to be a main character in every single thing in Middle-earth.
Right.
It's not very interesting. Yeah. He is just bad
He's
guy.
just there. He's not even there. He's there.
Yes.
I would go with more of like he's more like a Morgoth, and Vader is the Sauron in that he's even more detached of. He's sort of the fundamental reason that this evil exists, and that's it. So this is not a character that you interact with because there's nothing.
We're getting
there to
really
change.
nerdy here. We're deviating from Star Wars nerdy to deep cut Lord of the Rings lore.
If you know the name Morgoth, welcome to the corner table. Apparently, no, but it's true, and it's just him he's not a good antagonist to carry across 9 movies and TV shows and everything else. We need some more.
We need something.
Darth Vader, even Darth Vader. I love Darth Vader.
Yeah. And he was phenomenal for 3 episodes. And I'm glad that we had that, and it was great. And I'm even okay with keeping him being the primary focus of the prequels.
Yeah.
I'd just like to have a different villain, couple different characters that are not like, oh, here's this guy that we arbitrarily have to shoehorn in. And then let the sequels be their own thing.
Yeah. Just move on.
Just move. Yeah. If you want to have some cameos, because that'll be, you get your little clip that you can put in a trailer and everyone's like, fine, whatever. But don't make that the point.
Exactly. The whole, I'm sure it'll come up some a little bit later, but the whole idea of the sequels just retreading the exact same threads. We have basically the exact same world, but we've changed the names around. We have the First Order, but it's
still just the Empire.
The best part of the sequels was actually when people were dealing with the fact that there wasn't a Skywalker or a Palpatine.
Yes.
Right.
And then
we shoehorned them in.
And then we put them back in,
Yep.
That one part of Episode 8, then it wasn't terrible, was like, oh. they hit a little pocket there.
Yeah.
All right.
That's what I've got. So we can go ahead and move on to Xavier.
So mine is, I'm not talking about the same thing, but we do have a little bit of crossover.
Sure.
When I look at Star Wars, one thing that really frustrates me about Star Wars in a modern sense is that, once again, they start out very lofty, long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, and it's called Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And then almost all the stories are about the Chippy Rebellion fighting against the Empire.
Yeah.
And that's it. There's not really, like, wars in Star Wars.
Yeah.
Even when we go to the prequels, which do a slightly better job, we end up fighting droids versus clones.
Right.
Immediately diffuses all of the conflict because there's no people dying.
There are things dying, not people.
Exactly. And it's a random war that feels weird because it still somehow has to be Palpatine fighting with himself.
Well, yeah.
The part of what doesn't make sense there is that there's so many more things that they introduce that are cool and that look like they could be multiple factions, a little messier, like a real war For example,
Right.
you have wow, now I forgot his name. What's it called? The Slug Man. Why did I
Jabba?
Jabba. Sorry. Sorry, I should have written his name in my notes. Jabba the Hutt clearly has his own power, and he's separate from both sides. Why are the Hutts not ever at conflict with anyone else?
Right.
Even the idea of the Trade Federation is cool, but then they're just a proxy villain. They're only
They
set up.
don't do anything.
They don't do anything, and they're specifically only there to lose to set up for the Clone Wars. Doesn't make any sense. So, in general, I think that Star Wars, one of the biggest problems is that it doesn't ever actually handle the wars, which lead a lot into the core conflict of the original movies and the things that actually made Star Wars interesting to begin with.
Sure.
So, I think in general that we need to get into Star Wars needs to go back into the messiness of war, which also seems to be what they were hinting at when they talked about the Clone Wars and the original trilogies.
Yep.
It was very much talked about like a regular old war.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, Anakin's a great pilot, and they're talking about some of the dangers there. I think that would have been a much more interesting way to go about things, and it also plays a lot better towards the strengths of Star Wars. Like you said, you talked about the core of Star Wars being like the Force, which I think is fair, and like the whole light side, dark side.
Yeah.
The whole temptation to evil thing didn't make a lot of sense as pitched outside of basically episode 5 and 6.
Yeah.
Most of it is very contrived.
Yep.
Why is Anakin's impetus for being evil that his wife was pregnant and he thought she was going to die in childbirth? It doesn't
really line up, does it?
It's not one-to-one at all.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. And there's all these storytelling blocks that are already there. Again, if we're not fighting droids versus clones, could it not be that Anakin is struggling with the dark side because he has to kill people in a wartime situation?
Right.
And there's this conflict that's built in, again with Luke, in terms of like reaching for power to beat my enemy, but then also trying to stay good. So I think that that's a much cleaner direction to move in, away from all this stuff that we currently have going on, where again the rebellion piece is not really a war. It doesn't really fit that way.
Go ahead.
Would you also then change the way that the war works in terms of the betrayal of the Jedi, in which you could have them die, for lack of a better term, like more organically during the wars, rather than Order 66 was executed? Exactly,
because if the Jedi, for example, just kind of lost the war, also it leaves plenty of room still for betrayal on Anakin's part.
Sure.
There's plenty of ways that someone can be a turncoat and lose a war or get their brothers killed, but also for the way that they're treated in the original series, where the Jedi are kind of mythical, they've been gone a long while. It's like, if they just died over time and no one told their story, that makes a lot more sense than
They were all murdered, like, I don't know, like 10, 15 years ago.
I was going to say, what's the distance there? It's not very long.
No, I mean, it's however old Luke is.
Yeah, I think it's like 20 years or so.
Yeah, at most.
At most. It's like, 20 years ago, the Republic, which existed, went away, and the hundreds if not thousands of Jedi, they all got killed.
Yep.
Yeah.
What?
And I guess we just all forgot about that.
That's just not relevant. You have the same problem with the sequels, but that's fine.
It has been, at least it's consistent within canon that just the Star Wars universe, people do not have long memories.
No.
Right? There were people on Coruscant who would have lived in the old Republic, Republic, and then through the Empire, and then after the Empire.
Yes.
They would have. They were like conquered France, basically. But it's like, okay, did they just forget what it was to be French, or how any of that stuff goes? The sequels are worse for that, because we had all this time. There was 100 different ways you could build a conflict besides. It's never really established in the movies. I'm sure if you looked, you could probably find a few novelizations that gave you a reason why suddenly the First Order exists.
Yeah.
And they're in power.
Yeah.
Over someone.
Right.
I think in the last movie, I think they showed a planet, at least, people celebrating being free.
Yeah.
Eventually.
But it was like nobody that we had connection with.
Yeah.
And it's like, the war, you get no sense of war. There's like a scene or two that feel like wartime. Like in episode 8, there's the scene where they do like the bombing run.
Yeah.
Little there's some problems with it, but at the same time, it's like, oh, okay, this is
a battle.
a battle. There's sacrifice.
Yeah.
There's some drama that's built up there that you just leave on the table for the most part in Star Wars.
What I would push back very, very minorly in that I think the Clone Wars TV show brings in a little bit more of that war aspect. I do agree with you that you do not get it in the movies.
Yes.
Mostly. Like obviously it's there as kind of a backdrop, but it doesn't take kind of a center stage place. I would say that Clone Wars does bring that to the forefront significantly more, where you have more of these kind of political interactions between multiple factions and stuff like that going on.
Yeah.
It goes. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, and it does lean a lot more on normal wartime storytelling sorts of elements. That are mostly lost in the prequel films.
Yes. Go ahead. I was gonna bring up Andor again and say that's also feels very much like a wartime movie.
Exactly.
So it does exist.
It does exist. I think it's more so that stuff needs to be.
It's just not in the main movies.
It's not in the main movies, and it's just it's sort of pushed off to the side. It's also kind of hard to do some of it if the main movies don't cover it. So again, the book I mentioned, Twilight Company, it's wartime in episode 5.
Yep.
Makes sense and it works.
Yeah.
Even there's newer stuff coming out, like the you guys, I don't doubt either of you read any of the Thrawn books.
I
have not.
Yes.
The old ones.
Yes.
Which are not canon.
No.
They much more interesting way of handling clones there.
Yes.
But then they threw that away. There's newer ones too that are set during the original movies, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, it makes sense. Wartime.
Yeah.
What people in the Empire would be doing, because there's a lot of interesting like economic factors for why people would go for one side or the other that just don't come up when it's about Palpatine mind controlling people or something. I don't know. Or building a clone army. IDK. But I get what you're saying. It's true that stuff does come up more in specific, like the Clone Wars TV show does an okay job of covering the wartime part of Clone Wars.
Right. How would you handle world building of, say, different planets going to war with each other in the context of the Star Wars story? Is that something that could be worked in?
That, I think, is something that could definitely be worked in. Again, it feels like they have a lot of seeds of conflict.
Yep.
Which is where a lot of the interesting world building comes from. For example, Tatooine is established as being a desert planet.
Yes.
Where people have to moisture farm. It would make total sense that they would have some problems with Coruscant, which is a nice planet.
Yeah.
Or that Coruscant would need things from Naboo or from some other planet because it seems to be entirely industrial. It's just a massive city at this point. Where do they get their food? What are they looking? Yep. How is that set up? We have a intergalactic Senate, but not a ton of conflict between individual planets or actors.
Right.
I think they had everything in place to do it in all this.
It's almost like each planet doesn't understand that any of the other planets even exist.
Exactly.
Right.
Or that they are in any way distinct from one another. It's like, no, we're just the galaxy. That's where I live.
Yep.
Yes. So I do think that there's a lot of things already there. You don't actually need to do a lot of brand new world building. It's more so to take the world building that exists and make it relevant to the story. Because right now it's just, Tatooine is a set that we have that's sandy.
Yep.
That's all it gets to do. In the sequels, they go there. No, it wasn't Tatooine.
No, it's a different sand planet.
It's a different
sand planet. I don't remember what it is.
Jakku. And it's like, what's the relevance of Jakku? Or like why it would matter?
Why does anybody live here?
Right.
Or even why, are they? Are they part of the First Order's controlled space? I think so.
Or presumably.
Apparently.
Are they
the First Order got to show up, without interruption, so yeah, probably.
But is this like East Germany, or is this or is this like Russia proper? Like where are we right now?
Yeah.
So anyway, I think all that stuff is just not used. And even though they have everything they need to make it interesting.
Yeah. Especially when you have, going with occupied France and East Germany, like the Empire has some serious Nazi symbolism going on.
Yes.
That just is unused, it's just largely. It's just there as just like, here's a picture of like, here's Nazis in space, but only visually.
Here's how you know who the villain is.
Right.
Yeah. that looks like a Nazi guy.
Yeah.
Like
we will also just call them stormtroopers so that you really get the idea.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's what is it like to live under Empire rule? Because in some places it's actually probably pretty nice.
Yeah, exactly. And you
nice
don't
things.
get that.
You don't get any of that.
You don't get any. You don't get any of that kind of two sides to every conflict type of thing. Right. You just have like, well, this is the evil one and this is the good one, and that's all that you get on it.
It's never really explained why anybody would ever fight for the evil one.
Right.
And it's
aside from the fact that obviously millions of people are.
Yeah, they just we know what they do, but it's
we're
like
not told why.
Yeah,
they're just evil.
Yeah,
and you don't need it. Doesn't all need to be morally gray. It doesn't all need to be like there are lots of war stories that are heroic.
Yeah,
but at the same time, they play into this conflict, which is ignored.
Right. I mean, like, it doesn't have to be morally gray. Same with Nazi Germany, where it's just like, they are the bad guys.
Yes.
Period.
But they're also humans.
But they're also humans. And you have, like, there is a reason that people were, beyond just like, I am German and therefore I'm a Nazi. Like, there were reasons that people did this.
Yes.
Not good ones in terms of morally good ones, but they were
in terms of understandable
reasons.
They were like they're understandable reasons, and those should exist. And
right.
All the things are there for the original trilogy and for the sequels.
Yep.
And they kind of just threw
Dropped
that out of the window in the prequels because we put up two forces that don't have any agency. So the clones are evil because they were programmed to be evil, essentially.
Yeah.
And droids are going to be evil if they do whatever their evil master tells them to do.
Right.
Yes. We have two armies constructed to be evil, fighting each other. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So that's why I think they should put Star Wars back to wars. I think that's where it does the best.
Yeah,
where you can show off the good things that are already there. Just reformat, just reframe where you set your stories, and build up that part of the world.
Yeah. Neat.
So that was my pitch there. Make Star Wars more about wars. Braylon wanted to go away from the Skywalker Palpatine saga. Kevin, what do you think is all the problems in Star Wars?
All the problems. Okay, well, we don't have enough time to get into all the problems.
Right.
So we'll just focus on one today. So I was rewatching the original trilogy this week. I got through the first two movies. That's all I had time for. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me, and this has been a common complaint, is how ineffective the stormtroopers as a character are, right? The entire collection of people as a single story piece. Because even though they're part of an empire, and this empire is supposed to be the Goliath against which the rebel underdogs are fighting, they never do anything. They're just sort of there, and they shoot in the hero's general direction and always miss.
Yes.
Now, one of the problems with that is, well, if we have them actually being fantastic shots, they kill our main characters, and then, well, the story ends very quickly.
The story doesn't have that.
So how do you make stormtroopers an actual threatening character in a way that you can take them seriously and they make sense in the context in which they're placed?
Yes.
Rather than being essentially like the equivalent of evil red shirts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I noticed is, well, first, let's take a look at where stormtroopers seem to be somewhat effective and where they aren't. There are two places in the first two movies where I would say they are actually useful for something. First is when the rebel ship is being boarded, or when the Federation ship is being boarded with the rebels on it. Now, they're fighting against the rebels who are not putting up a fairly effective fight, tactically speaking.
It's red shirts versus red shirts.
Yeah. Jobbers all around, but they were still but they still won the jobber fight with Darth Vader's assistance.
They did. So they just proved that they're not the bottom of the effectiveness here in the Star Wars world building. And then the second one is the attack on Hoth.
Yes.
Where they actually, like, there's actually some conflict there of, the rebels are punching and the stormtroopers are punching back.
Yeah, they're actually they're able to move effectively together and actually challenge the base.
Yeah.
Right.
And then in episode 6, they get their butt handed to them by teddy bears. So they go back down.
That does happen. They're useless. Is that which planet is that again? Is that
that's
Endor?
On the forest moon of Endor.
Endor, that's it.
Yes.
So it's they're useless on Endor, they're useless on Mos Eisley, they're useless on the Death Star, they're useless on Bespin.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, well, the problem is that if they can't really actually be useful, because otherwise we'd have to rewrite the entire story.
Yes.
How do we make this more of a threat? And so the way that I would go about this is change the way that stormtroopers are viewed through the lens of the story.
Yes.
Okay.
So the problem right now is, okay, the idea is you have stormtroopers and they will shoot you and they will kill you.
Yes.
Let's change that to, okay, everybody knows stormtroopers can't hit anything, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, this is all known. What they do have is fierce loyalty and numbers.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Right? And so you have the idea of, okay, this is a stormtrooper. The stormtrooper's not affected, but he has the entire resources of the Empire behind him.
Yeah.
So if you throw a stone at a stormtrooper, some secretary will open up a case on, some processing planet somewhere, and then, a month later, the Empire will come in and kill you and your entire extended family.
Yeah.
In a way, you're moving the stormtroopers away from being an opposing army to being more a force of nature.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They almost act narratively. They're going to act very similar to zombies, where it's not that I'm worried that a zombie could beat me, but I can't deal with the horde of zombies. There's no way for me to overcome the numbers that they have and the coordination that they bring.
Right. Which it does have the unfortunate effect of sort of dehumanizing the stormtroopers, but
they're already just helmeted.
We've already done that, right? Again, we can't
Humanoids.
We can't have an interesting, okay, here's the life of a stormtrooper unless you want to go to episode 7.
Right.
Yes.
As well as that did or didn't work out.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But for the original trilogy,
We don't have
an
time. Interesting concept that they did nothing with.
Yes.
Right. And so if we're accepting in the original trilogy and the clones in the prequels are going to be faceless mooks.
Yes.
Okay, then let's make them proper faceless mooks.
Yes. Because they aren't really utilized super well during even I really like the original movies, but the stormtroopers themselves aren't very well utilized in terms of danger.
No.
Even in episode 5 when the Cloud City is being invaded.
Yep.
The real threat is that Darth Vader's there.
Yeah.
It's like, oh no, there's stormtroopers and Darth Vader, and Darth Vader's the problem. Whereas in general, there clearly weren't enough people there to deal with just a flood of stormtroopers.
Right.
That would be a problem in and of itself. But
Yeah.
that makes sense in terms of practically speaking. I'm sure they couldn't put that many extras
Right.
in the scene, but we're just talking about the world building in general, and how we would use these things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There is the limitation of, okay, back when these are originally filmed, we can't do an army of, thousands of stormtroopers like they could do for the prequels.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And so that's also why I'm doing the focus of, okay, well, we need to change this to, we can't put this many guys on screen, but we want to give you the story interactor, the viewer, the reader, or whatever have you, at least the feeling that, okay, there are more and they are coming.
Yep.
Yes.
Right? So if we are on Mos Eisley and we can't get off this planet now, we know that tomorrow there's going to be a couple of Star Destroyers showing up in orbit and nobody is going anywhere.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
we need to get off today or we're not leaving.
So go on.
Not to keep fanboying over Endor too much,
Yes.
but that is noted in that show.
Okay.
And a big portion of it, you actually have kind of one of the main storylines is a Imperial officer, and so you have like you see the machine behind it, and like there is a lot of that same thing. And I think one of the things is like it helps that it's just kind of like these are just normal people. There's nobody has like the Force, nobody has anything kind of really helping them out.
Yes.
And there is that idea of, okay, well, we managed to like we snuck in, we killed this battalion, and now we need to leave because there is a Star Destroyer coming.
Exactly. And there's no way for rebels to deal with a Star Destroyer.
Right.
It's actually one of the things that is better handled by Episode 8, one of the few things that it does do okay.
Yeah.
Is the idea with the blockade is that, okay, we do not have the forces to overcome this.
Right.
They have all of these battleships. We can't beat that. We need some other solution.
Yeah.
And so, the idea with what you're saying, like on Mos Eisley, if we got specific for how would this work? It's like, well, they see stormtroopers on Mos Eisley. They know if we don't get out of here, they're gonna call home. Hey,
Right.
They have eyes everywhere. we need to worry about if we see 2, then there's probably 100.
Yep.
Or there's 100 about to come.
Yes, exactly. And a couple of ways that you could demonstrate that is one would be changing the way that the Sandcrawl investigation works.
Yeah.
Right? When Ben and Luke go and look at it. Rather than saying only stormtroopers are so precise, change it to something like only stormtroopers are so thorough. Right?
Sure.
And the idea is that this thing's been ransacked from
Yeah.
top to bottom looking for evidence of where did these droids go.
Yes.
And another thing you could do is maybe on Mos Eisley something like there are stormtroopers on or in Mos Eisley when Ben and Luke show up.
Yes.
Yeah.
But aside from a couple of checks, they don't really seem to be doing a whole lot rather than looking around. And so maybe you could throw in a scene or a background event where somebody harasses a stormtrooper and then suddenly, okay, here are 20 more that show up and just absolutely wreck this guy. It's like, oh, okay, we are actually under a police state. Like, this is martial law right now. This is not just, oh, there's some guys conducting an investigation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, kind of to your point, it's felt within the original trilogy that really the threat of the Empire is its size, not its expertise. But the problem is that they too often that size is not enforced or doesn't feel like a threat around the corner.
Right.
Aside from like the 2 Death Stars, and occasionally you get like a couple Star Destroyers showing up, and you're like, oh, okay, yes, that is why you are in power. Not this dude that can't hit the broadside of a barn.
Yeah. And it's not even Darth Vader. It's like, no, it's the long arm of the Empire being being shown through the stormtroopers themselves.
Yep.
Are the threat in and of themselves for most people.
Which you can also then extend that into explaining why the Empire has to be so active and like why they would need a Death Star, because they overreact to every little thing that happens.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. And so, sure, they have a ton of resources, but because they're so ineffective at distributing them, it's okay, well, we need a Death Star to up this, because if punching things doesn't work, let's blow it up. Punch things harder.
Exactly. Like, which planet did they blow up in episode 4 again? It was
Alderaan, right?
Yeah. Alderaan. It's like, technically, they probably could have sent a few Star Destroyers and quelled any problems on Alderaan, but that's really inefficient. Those Star Destroyers have to come from somewhere.
Right.
The Death Star is just a way for them to have a lot more leverage rather than having to use all their manpower all the time.
Right. And then, so you can actually extend this one step further and bring Darth Vader in, because, so in episode 4 on the Death Star, he's constantly quarreling with the Admiralty, right?
Yes.
Like, he and them do not see eye to eye.
No.
And this would be another way that you could bring that in, by having Vader essentially criticizing the way that the Empire is doing the sort of suppression tactics of, guys, why are we just punching everything harder? Let's be a little bit more sophisticated about this.
Yes.
Because Darth Vader is about the only person in the Empire who actually shows any amount of tact. Like, he will actually hand Han Solo over to the bounty hunters and keep his word there. He will keep people alive if he thinks they will be useful later, rather than just kill everybody that he sees.
Yeah, the Empire, the stormtroopers are very much a sledgehammer. They just smash whatever that's an enemy, we destroy everything. Again, Alderaan will blow up the whole planet because that's easier than anything else.
Right.
Okay, so you're saying like bringing in Darth Vader as a deliberate contrast.
Right. And then you can sort of take that into one step higher, and Darth Vader represents sort of like channeled hate, whereas the Empire is just raw, unbridled hate.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very and that's a very interesting contrast if you want to use them as a storytelling force in the world to talk about the dark side. It's like, well, the Empire and stormtroopers are all individually helping the dark side, but it's in a very different way than the channeled malice that Darth Vader might have.
Right.
Yeah, it's just general, simple evil. Yeah.
Right. And this is why he and the Emperor would actually want to like recruit Luke in.
Yes.
Right.
Especially even if you're doing this whole rule of 2 thing or whatever that comes up later on. It's but here's somebody who actually seems to have his head screwed on straight. So let's get another Force user in here to help us manage things.
Exactly. We'll have another scalpel, someone who can actually do this properly. No, I think that's an interesting thing. That's a very interesting way of approaching it. And that's a kind of a narrative element that you could reuse even in the future or in the past. to use the stormtroopers as this monolithic force. It's honestly kind of similar to. It's much more human, but kind of similar to the clones. But
Yes.
But the clones are dehumanized. It takes away a ton of the actual importance of them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, cool.
We've gotten 3 different takes here. We went 3 different directions that I like a lot.
Yeah.
And in general, I think we'd all agree that we like the original movies and Star Wars is cool. There's like a lot of things left on the table to be used that just
there's so much.
aren't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was kind of the whole point of my change.
Like, you know,
it's like you've got a whole galaxy.
Exactly. Like you don't need
Use
to
it.
You don't need to rebuild every single thing and
Right.
introduce. We don't need that much more lore. There's enough here. It just needs more layering and needs to be better utilized. Because everything from stormtroopers all the way up to the ideas of war itself
Yes.
aren't really touched. It's mostly it's mostly just a story about Skywalker versus Palpatine.
Yep.
Because we couldn't even come up with a new villain ever.
And then there's some things around for them to bounce off of.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, we'd probably need a Death Star in there somewhere. So
Yeah. We've had a couple of those. Put in another one.
What's better than 2 Death Stars?
A planet Death
3 Death
Star.
Stars.
Yes. Well, we could do, instead of a Death Star, a bunch of little
Death Stars.
At least the prequels didn't do that. But
Yeah, that is true.
all right, cool. This has been a good time.
Yeah.
It's been the Corner Table Podcast. We might do more of these rebuilds. Let us know if you enjoyed this one, if you agree with what we had to say, or have your own things that need to be changed in Star Wars to make it better.
Definitely.
But yeah, if you enjoyed, leave us a like. We'll see you guys later.